Live. Welcome, ladies, gentlemen, extraterrestrials, hobbits, and cryptids, to our fifth episode of Scuttlebutt with the Phill on the Fleet Admiral Levi channel. If you're watching this now or in the future, please leave a like or comment or share it if you liked it. But in reality, subscribe. It really does help the channel. As always, I'm here to say a few things, do a couple of things, and hopefully leave a little of myself to the infamy of the internet. Tonight we'll be discussing one major item: the state of fantasy. So, like yesterday, where we discussed the state of horror, we will be discussing a little bit of what's going on in horror or Fantasyland, and hopefully, um, you'll like what you'll see. Now, in general, as I'm sort of reiterating my point from last night, I don't personally think of fantasy as my top genre, even though I do consider it to be a genre that I'm willing to do more learning about. I mean, I'm not a complete novice to fantasy, but I don't actively seek it out as much as some other genres. I've Last night I ranked my genres as science fiction, fantasy, or science fiction, horror, and then fantasy. There's sort of a small uh, gap in between the two. So that does say a little bit about how I feel about it. But in general, my fantasy tastes are a little bit different than some others because I know that the bulk of fantasy these days kind of comes in a couple of flavors. And I think what sort of soured me on fantasy tends to be um, kind of a predilection to want to do your own spin on Lord of the Rings or on Harry Potter. And those two flavors usually oscillate in really drastic ways. Your Lord of the Rings knockoffs, I think, can definitely turn into their own sort of fantastical realm and be completely okay and work really effectively. I think um, Game of Thrones is an example of that, and so is the rapid success of Dungeons and Dragons as of late, and various other Lord of the Rings adjacent sort of properties. Um, you end up with the YA sort of Harry Potter esque fantasy stories that came out in like the 2000s and part of the 2010s. You had Percy Jackson's novels and TV shows and movies, and then you had a few other little stories that came out afterwards that I think helped contribute to making the genre a lot more mainstream. And I think fantasy sells way better in pretty much everywhere, at least in terms of books. Of the three genres, science fiction, fantasy, and horror, fantasy outsells the other two genres, at least in the written format. In terms of television and movies, I mean, television's hard to kind of gauge, but in terms of the films, I mean, it appears that uh, fantasy does do a little bit better in many respects than horror or even science fiction. Although I think you get a higher return on investment from independent horror films than you would from an independent fantasy film. Um, you have fantasy video games that are still popular. I mean, just about a decade ago, Skyrim was the big thing, and you have a bunch of little MMO games that are constantly being produced and released. So you have these things out there in the cultural zeitgeist. But we'll talk a little bit more about specific stories that I think are pretty notable and kind of are emblematic of where the genre seems to be going. Um, I think it's very fascinating to learn about and sort of suss that out. But in terms of fantasy books, even when I was a kid, um, this is like the early 2000s, like 2001. So this is Lord of the Rings, Harry Potter time. And Kyle, my little brother, and I are sitting around with my sister, Vivian, and she's reading us. We're sitting down for possibly days, weeks, just working our way through these very large doorstopper style Lord of the Rings books, which have all three books assembled together as some sort of an omnibus. And yeah, we're just working our way through it. And my sister was always very encouraging of writing and reading. And I think that's partially why I went the route I did, and partially why my little brother went sort of wherever he wanted to go with his inspiration. He's definitely more of the fantasy guy than I am. He's definitely more of the Dungeons and Dragons player than I am. Um, it's not that I would say I hate fantasy or anything, but it's just that it's typically been a little bit harder for me to dive into them. And I don't really even think it's because of the realistic attitude or even the fantastical elements of fantasy. It's just execution. And if I feel like it's too derivative, and it doesn't take a whole lot to make a story that's fantasy its own thing. And I just wish there were more writers out there that did their best to distinguish themselves from any old Lord of the Rings adjacent knockoff or Harry Potter adjacent knockoff. In the world of fantasy books, I'm a little bit kind of unsure of what's out. I'm going to dive into at least a couple of these, but yeah, forgive me. Yeah, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, I would consider its own distinct thing, especially since the writer C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien were pretty much kind of friends, and I believe it was Tolkien who converted C.S. Lewis to hardcore Christianity, which I think is interesting. Um, one of these days, I do have to dive into that. I would consider Terry Pratchett's Discworld books to be fantasy, and that's kind of a fantasy style thing that I am interested in. So I would like to. I bought what I believe is the first book of that series, and I do think I'm going to try to dive into that more and more. There's a series of fantasy books that Robert Jordan created, and then I believe one of those books is what inspired Brandon Sanderson to start writing his stuff. And so I think that's also interesting and informative. I mean, one day I would like to do an interpretation of the Arthurian legends, put my own spin on it, strictly because it seems like it would be an uh, interesting little exploration of the genre since I've never done it before. Beyond this, I guess I would be lying if I said that um, one of my all-time favorite kind of fantasy aesthetic, fantastical aesthetic style science fiction story and series is the Dragon Riders of Pern series. It was the second book I ever bought with my own money, and first book being Dune. And yeah, I was whisked away to this fantastical world where um, you had these fire lizards that they genetically modify to into what we would refer to as like a dragon to fly into the air and burn these little objects called thread that can destroy anything in their path. And for whatever reason, I did gravitate toward those stories. And I ever had fortune to adapt it, I definitely would jump at the chance. It would not only be my first kind of dive into science fiction, but also a science fiction fantasy adaptation. I have not read his Dark Materials. I do believe that's fantasy. There's an encyclopedia of fantasy. Wow. You know, Neil Gaiman does a lot of sort of play with the genre. It would be interesting to see how that all worked out. I guess some people would distinguish the Lord of the Rings adjacent science fiction as like high fantasy, and some would distinguish Harry Potter like fantasy to a style of urban fantasy. So I guess it depends on which side of that argument you believe you're on. But I've not read much of the fantasy novels of Brandon Sanderson or J.R. or George R.R. Martin with Game of Thrones. I haven't even dived into the show. It is funny though that the actor Josh Gad, he was speaking. He was doing a signing at Universal City Walk's Things from Another World comic book store, and I met him. And he was somebody I didn't think I'd meet. We had a conversation for a couple minutes, but it seemed pretty substantial. And he was even recommending that look at House of the Dragon as an inspiration for writing, and thought that was an interesting recommendation. Um, yeah, that was an interesting day. I've not seen that either. I hope to see it at some point. There is a fantasy novel I need to dive back into at some point since my brother and I received it for, we were members of the science fiction book club back in the early to mid 2000s, and we get books and tons of books every, I think it was every month. And I don't think my dad appreciated that too much since it seemed like he would have to be paying out the nose for it at random points. And so, yeah, I don't think he liked that much. But um, it is something that happened. So, leaving the book realm to the television realm, I'm going in a specific order. The Rings of Power, I've not seen, even though I've heard a mixture of good and bad about it. The Umbrella Academy, I've not watched. What We Do in the Shadows is considered fantasy somehow. You already mentioned them in the horror stream. I am vaguely interested in watching the remake of Bandits as a TV show. I haven't seen that yet, though. The Discovery of Witches, not seen. And House of the Dragon. Not sure where they put For All Mankind in fantasy realm, but okay. I do consider Stranger Things to be more of a sci-fi horror than a fantasy. You put Outlander in here too. The television adaptation of American Gods is here. It's also something I've not seen. I've not seen quite a lot. I think that's very bad form for me. Yeah, that's quite remarkable. But if you have any recommendations for quality fantasy television, let me know, and I will do my best to make time for it in the weeks and months to come. But yes, in terms of fantasy movies, I've definitely dived into quite a bit over the last few years. I mentioned, I think, last night as part of the State of Horror stream that one of my favorite um, fantasy films of the last, I would say, at least 10 years, was The Green Knight, starring Dev Patel as the knight Sir Gawain. And I think around that time, or maybe a little bit before, I was attending a British literature course, and we'd read the story of the original primary source of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. And for some reason, that story kind of resonated with me, and I've just always kind of enjoyed reading about it and learning about it. And I think I highly recommend the film to anybody that wants a different kind of a flavor to their fantasy. It was definitely more in the kind of realm that I would like to explore um, in fantasy, because it's kind of like this gritty groundedness, but still able to extend beyond that into the fantastic and into the even elements of the unknown a little bit. And that definitely is something that appeals to me as both a writer and a viewer. I do remember watching The Dark Crystal as a kid, and some images do stick out to me and have inspired me even to this day, but I've not actually watched it all the way through since then, so one time I do have to actually do that. I've heard nothing but bad things about the Hobbit movies, and I don't know if I plan to sit down and watch them at any point. But I do plan to revisit the Lord of the Rings movies at some point, strictly because I've actually never sat down to watch the extended editions, and the fact that it's like a 12 plus hour um, endeavor is kind of daunting to me, and I don't know when I'll ever have that much time to dedicate to that, but eventually it might be a thing to do. The movie Rain of Fire, I do remember seeing it, or I do remember seeing clips of it. This was like a Matthew McConaughey, Christian Bale thing, where like dragons start to invade London or something. Very weird. Oh yeah, and then last year, beginning of last year, they had adapted Dungeons and Dragons to the screen for the first time, at least a big budget uh, motion picture, and that was Dungeons and Dragons: Honor Among Thieves, which I think starred Chris Pine and then numerous other actors. And that one I did like quite a bit. I don't know if it performed well or not, but I do recommend people check it out. It's fun. Beyond this, there's a bunch of little random things thrown in here. You got the Labyrinth, which I do like, and the Never-Ending Story, which also I do like. Um, I'm told they might be remaking that at some point. I think that'll be an interesting little adventure. Although, with as much cultural cachet as that story has, it's been circulating for the last, when this come out, 84, yeah, 40 years. That's going to be a lot harder to impress people, but it's not impossible. I mean, I know a lot of people didn't like the Wonka prequel that was released, I think, late last year. I mean, I thought it was fine. My best friend thought it was trash. I think he actually left the theater. That's one of the things I do pride myself on. I've never left the theater, nor have I ever felt the need to fall asleep during a movie. As I get older, I kind of fear that that's going to be imminent. A couple of films on this little Google thing. It says The Shape of Water. I think it's the first fantasy film, at least of that type, to win an Oscar, and it's a Guillermo del Toro directed and written film. So that just seems like it's a given. He also produced a his own version of Pinocchio, which was more of like a mix of stop motion effects and miniature sort of style stuff that I thought was very interesting. His portrayal of it and his interpretation of it, I think, is very interesting. Since in most adaptations of Pinocchio, the character tends to be his goal is to become a real boy, but in this adaptation, spoiler alert, he doesn't. He lives his life out. He lives his life or whatever he has as the boy that he was, the wooden boy. And something about that theme is very interesting to me, since even Guillermo del Toro said that the purpose of that thematic element was to show that you don't change for other people, and I think that's a very strong thematic element. Um, the other movie that I think is interesting here is the movie Legend. I think that was a failure, a flop. But there is a character, I think it's Tim Curry, that plays the devil in there. And I think beyond that notable concept in the movie, I don't think the film is much notable for anything else. Although the design of the devil in that film is very iconic and interesting to me. The Princess Bride, I think, when did that one come out? 1987? Well, I think it's a fun movie. I do recommend that too. I would recommend a lot of Guillermo del Toro's fantastical stories, and beyond that too. Um, I don't know why I keep thinking that thematically, or at least aesthetically, in certain respects, I really don't know how to explain it. There's sort of a parallelism between the work of Guillermo del Toro and the work of Hayao Miyazaki of the Studio Ghibli movies. Um, I don't know what it is about them, but their styles are kind of, I think, somewhat complementary in some regards. Beyond this, I do really love the Harry Potter films, and those are definitely easier to watch as opposed to the endless Lord of the Rings movies. I've only seen, I think, the first two Fantastic Beasts movies, and I think the last one, I think, killed Harry Potter on the screen for at least the next few years. I think that's a little bit of a tragedy. Although I do hear that they're doing a television adaptation of it, which I think could be interesting. But with how iconic the first adaptation of Harry Potter was, I just don't know if it's possible to try to do better than that. Why mess with perfection? But yeah, no, really curious to see how they decide to attack that one. Oh yeah, I think the last fantasy thing I will mention as part of films, which will tie me back into TV shows, um, is Avatar: The Last Airbender. They made that a movie, directed by and written, I think, by one of my inspirations, M. Night Shyamalan. And unfortunately, I'm told, and I do believe, it's actually a awful film. I don't plan to watch it anytime soon. Um, but if I ever do, I'll let you guys know. And also, don't forget to mention any fantasy films that you think I might be interested that I didn't mention here. So please do uh, comment and let me know. But beyond this, too, there's sort of a problem of fantasy being a little bit Western in origin. Excuse me. Which is why I think Avatar is such an interesting take on the fantasy genre, since it tends to take more of an Asian influenced society and do a spin on that sort of thing, and I think it's done very effectively. And we just finished, my fiance and I, watching the Legend of Korra, which is, I think, the sequel television series to the original Avatar: The Last Airbender series, which was airing, I think, in the mid 2000s. And I think Legend of Korra didn't air until the 2010s. After watching both of them, my fiance said that she preferred the original Avatar series, and then I tended to lean toward Legend of Korra, probably because of all the sort of retro futuristic aesthetic stuff that kind of permeated that show. But Now, something about it I think was a little more interesting, I guess, because it was more modernized in some respects, and even though I think it's like set equivalent to like the first half of the 20th century, so at least like 70, 80 years ago in our time. But yeah, I mean, the Avatar Last Airbender franchise is based around the idea that there's this one being that can control all the elements, and supposedly in this world, you can control earth, wind, fire, water, um, some way. It's a kind of linked to more of a spiritual element. There are people who don't, who can't bend these things or control these things, and they tend to be people on the outside looking in. But yeah, no, I think I didn't grow up with it because I think it aired when I was like in my already becoming an older teenager. So I don't have the attachment to it that some people have. But now that I've watched it and seen the entirety of it, I have a little more of an appreciation for that series, and I do think it's very good. And a little bit of it is working its way to inspiring me in some of my own writing. And I think when a story does that, the story is done pretty well. So I think I would also recommend both Avatar: The Last Airbender, the animated series, and The Legend of Korra show to all my audience. I have not seen the live action Avatar yet, but I'm hoping that um, I can get around to it soon. I have not heard much about it, so I'm not sure if it's any good, but I know they got renewed because I remember there was a casting call for a specific character that has very specific um, characterization. So I'm curious to see how they approach that in the live action series. I'm actually kind of hoping they are able to not adapt the show verbatim, but I'm hoping that they continue on and then adapt for live action Legend of Korra eventually. And then I hope they get to a point where they can adapt maybe even another thing that is set in a more contemporary time. I think there's a lot of story potential in this Asian influenced world that I feel like we don't see often enough in fantasy because, like I said, I think due to the influence of J.R.R. Tolkien and now George R.R. Martin and a few other fantasy authors, fantasy tends to be heavily Western influenced. Like it's usually horses and swords, you know, sort of Arthurian legend adjacent style stuff, and yeah, that kind of stuff can be a little bit. I want to say exclusive, but it's definitely a very um, common flavor in fantasy, and I think that there's so much more that fantasy can offer, especially with the different aesthetics that are available around the world. Um, yeah, I'd be very curious to see other cultural influences inform a lot more new fantasy that comes out. Hopefully we do, and hopefully we see that soon. But beyond that, James Cameron is doing his Avatar films, which are completely unrelated to these Avatar properties. And his Avatar films are, or have been, at least there's only been two so far in various books and additional material about the world that those stories inhabit. And for me, I've always felt that the world of that Avatar, of James Cameron's Avatar, is a little different, and it's kind of a mix of science fiction and fantasy a little bit, just strictly because you're dealing with a lot of tribes that are spread around this moon, and sort of like Avatar: The Last Airbender. Each tribe kind of has access to a specific element or classical element. Um, I want to say that in the first movie, the society they ran into, that's sort of like the one we've been following for the bulk of the last two films. they were kind of like an earthy sort of faction. And in the recent film, we met like a water tribe, which I think is interesting. And then, according to the news out of Comic Con, there's going to be because the next film is going to be called Fire and Ash. So I guess we're going to meet the fire people of Pandora. So yeah, I think what he's doing is interesting. We'll see how closely it kind of overlaps with the Avatar: The Last Airbender stuff. I mean, so far there's been no bending of elements, so hopefully it stays that way and it doesn't end up going that way. But yeah, beyond that, yeah, that's about all I can think of on the state of fantasy. I wish I could give more time to it. I gave 45 minutes to horror, and it looks like we'll give a little over a half hour for fantasy. I've given probably you know, over the last few episodes, at least a few hours worth of material to um, science fiction. So I don't know if I'll be doing a state of science fiction stream, but I'm sure that'll be coming very soon as well. Um, yeah, beyond that too. Um, if anybody has any questions, you feel free to reach out to me. My information is everywhere here. You have my Twitter, you have my YouTube, and you also have my access to Linktree, where you can find pretty much everything about me anywhere on the internet. My digital footprint is rather large, but people won't know about it until you go and seek it out. So please do if you want to learn more about me, what I stand for, and what I want to do. But yeah, beyond that, I think we're pretty much going to wrap up a little bit earlier than usual. I'd like to keep my streams to about an hour, but I do have a obligation that I need to head out to shortly. But I wish you all a fantastic rest of your Sunday. And I hope you all tune in to. I didn't go last week because I've been reviewing, excuse me, I've been reviewing episodes of the Apple TV Plus series For All Mankind for a number of weeks now. And I missed last week because I was out at a teaching sort of training thing for a couple of days. So I was unable to attend. But please watch the Anti-Derivative Jill's show, Infinite Lunch and Infinite Combinations, I believe are shows. And that'll be on Tuesday morning. And I believe we'll be watching the final two episodes of season 2 of For All Mankind. And that'll close out the 1980s season. So, yeah, please check that out on Tuesday at 9 a.m. Pacific. But that'll be what we do on Tuesday. I'm still a little bit uncertain of when, because scheduling next week is going to be kind of wild because we'll be going right into the MFA program, both as a student and as a teacher. And it's going to be my first week. So I know we'll be doing a first week recap episode probably at the end of the week, maybe on a Saturday or Sunday, kind of like this. Um, haven't decided yet. Hopefully that one's about an hour or two, but we'll find out. Yeah. Beyond that, just stay tuned. Don't uh, don't think these episodes are going to get shorter. Um, we'll definitely get back up to an hour or even more, especially when we start adding more guests. So until next time, I just want you to know that we'll see you all next time. So keep the ravioli in orbit and don't take money from a man named Jack. We'll see you all soon.